What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Tuesday, June 11th edition of the Ship My Money Show. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. And we have a 12-game MLB slate tonight. Going to walk through all of those games, as always, talking about pitching, hitting, stacks, all of that stuff. But first, a couple of just general housekeeping things to start. Number one, if you are subscribed to this channel, or even if you're just somebody that searches for it every day to watch this show, the branding on the channel itself will be changing over from me personally to Endgame Syndicate, which is the company that I'm starting that I've mentioned before with Brick75, Utical, Nerdy Tenor. Nothing will change for you. This show will still be on here every day, doing the same thing, going game by game. The only possible change on your end will be occasional additional content from any of those guys. But that's just a general branding change, doesn't impact you, doesn't impact the shows or anything like that. The second is something that will, in the short term, impact the shows. I'm dealing with some family health stuff, so my schedule is kind of up in the air right now. So that's why we had the last minute cancellation yesterday. I'm kind of at the whims of just when appointments get scheduled right now. So I'm trying to do this show as consistently as I can, generally keeping it around noon like it has been. But there will be occasional days in the short term that I don't have it. That has nothing to do with the branding change on the channel or anything like that. It's just short-term stuff that I'm dealing with that hopefully gets taken care of sooner rather than later. But wanted to just kind of let everyone know about that. I'm not just waking up occasionally and deciding I'm not doing this show. So that's why it's going to be kind of hit or miss in the short term. But hopefully be back to a consistent schedule sooner than later on that. Now, getting into tonight's slate, obviously 12 games, so a lot of stuff to get through. Starting with the Miami Marlins taking on the New York Mets. Tyler McGill is on the mound for the Mets. We have Jesus Luzardo going for Miami. The Mets are returning from London, so I don't really know how that impacts anything here. Maybe we get a little bit shorter leash on McGill. Maybe we don't. I don't really know. Maybe we have just poor performance in general. I have absolutely no idea how to predict that. Don't really have data on how guys do returning from weekend trips to England. It doesn't happen very often, but it is a good spot for McGill. $7,300 price tag, projected for about 16% ownership. Showed up as optimal about 11 to 12% of the time in the lineups that I built. So he looks fine. Not a huge priority on a 12-game slate, but not somebody that I think we necessarily want to ignore either. His strikeout stuff in basically a handful of starts this year has been very good. 27% strikeout percentage. That is very likely to come down. He's more likely to be a low 20s strikeout guy, but this is a pretty good spot against Miami. It's a weak offense in general. It's a pretty good park for pitching. The Marlins offense against right-handed pitching this year has an 88 WRC+. They rank 14th in strikeout percentage. So overall, it just sets up as a pretty good spot for a mid-range salaried McGill. Jesus Luzardo on the other side, 8,100. Good strikeout pitcher. Not the best spot against the Mets. Just an offense that certainly does have talent in it. Their active roster against left-handed pitching since the start of last season ranks 22nd in strikeout percentage. They also have a 119 WRC+. So, again, it's a good strikeout pitcher in Luzardo. He's struck out 22.5% of hitters so far this season. That number is actually down a bit from, I think, where you would expect it to be and from where it was earlier in the year. 3.84 xFIP. Just looks like a secondary option here at 8,100. Nothing that I would expect to prioritize on a slate of this size, especially in this matchup. Offensively, I don't expect either team to look particularly good. If we look at stacks, we don't see either one very far up the list. That doesn't really surprise me here. Not a good park for home runs. Miami as a whole doesn't have a lot of power, so that's one team here that you're really probably going to have trouble getting to. Jazz Chisholm individually is going to look fine. Jake Berger is really cheap at 3,400, and he individually does have power. But as a team, Miami is going to be difficult to get to. The Mets, I think, would be the team that if I were going to stack, I would probably go to first. But they are a little bit more expensive than Miami. They have more talent, but I think you're just going to be able to find better spots in general on this slate. And then also, neither of these pitchers are getting a ton of ownership. So 15% coming into McGill. Yeah, there's some case to be made for negatively correlating against him, but on a 12-game slate, it's not as strong as if this were like a 6-game slate. And then you have even less ownership coming into Luzardo. So overall, I wouldn't say this game is a cross-off. There's certainly stuff you can get to if you want it. There's talent in this game, but I don't think there's anything that really stands out as a priority offensively or pitching wise. The closest thing I think is McGill as an SP2 on DraftKings at 7,300. Next, we have the Guardians taking on the Cincinnati Reds in Cincinnati. Great America Ballpark, very good park for hitting. One of the best parks in baseball over the last few seasons. You could argue that this is a park downgrade this year for Cleveland based on the way the ball's been flying out of their stadium. But in general, Cincinnati, one of the better places to hit. We have Tristan McKenzie going for Cleveland. Nick Martinez is expected to be the long reliever after Brent Suter for the Reds. No interest whatsoever in the Reds pitching here. It's a mess. It's also a tough strikeout matchup. But Tristan McKenzie, if you're going to a pitcher in this game, is, I think, the only real option. I don't really want to get to him either. Again, this is a tough park to pitch in Cincinnati. McKenzie hasn't been particularly good this year. We have seen some more strikeouts from him recently than at the beginning of the season. He's up to a 22.3% K percentage. But he does still have a 13% walk percentage. He has to allow 2 home runs per 9 innings. I think at this point, he's somebody that in good matchups and a good park, sure, maybe you get to him. On a slate with 24 pitchers, or even if you want to say 23 because Cincinnati doesn't really count, I don't think Tristan McKenzie in Great American is going to be any sort of a priority. Offensively, the teams here are going to look pretty good, I would expect. Cleveland showing up 4th most. Cincinnati a little bit further down the list when it comes to stacks. Like I said, McKenzie has given up power this year. So even though Cincinnati stacks aren't showing up a ton, I do think that there is some upside. 175 expected ISO allowed to righties, 259 to lefties. And the thing that really stands out here in McKenzie's splits so far isn't even the difference in power allowed, since he has really allowed power to both sides. It's that he's only struck out 17% of left-handed hitters this season compared to 27% of righties. That's a really big deal, especially when you're talking about facing somebody like Elly De La Cruz, who has a lot of power but also strikes out a lot. If De La Cruz is likely to put the ball in play, that makes him look very good. Now, one other negative for Cincinnati as a stack and for their hitters individually, Cleveland has the best bullpen in baseball. So if you get Tristan McKenzie out of this game, there's some chance that whoever comes in for Cleveland is having an off day, but it's a very, very good bullpen. You're not likely to be adding on a ton of runs after you get McKenzie out. So that is one reason that Cincinnati's implied run total isn't higher than it is. But in the matchup against McKenzie, to start the game, De La Cruz in particular does look very good. The Cleveland side's going to look, I think, a little bit more appealing just because you're not facing the Cleveland bullpen. But it's still not the most appealing matchup because you do get 1 inning of Brent Suter, and then you're going to get, call it probably 3-4 innings or something from Nick Martinez, who isn't a terrible pitcher. He's not good, but it's not like he's an awful pitcher following up Suter. So the park is, I think, the real reason that offenses are going to look good here. Jose Ramirez, always a high upside third base play. Josh Naylor's gotten a little bit less expensive, which is nice. David Fry is still extremely expensive. I'm actually surprised he's showing up as much as he is right now in the lineups that I built before the show. But from a stacking standpoint, I think Cleveland looks fine. They would look better if they were cheaper. But Jose Ramirez does help pull that stack up a little bit. And individually, Jose Ramirez is just going to look like a very good play. Also worth noting with Ramirez, he is a switch hitter. So the fact that you're getting a left-handed opener in Brent Suter and then following it up with a right-handed long reliever in Nick Martinez doesn't really have any impact on Ramirez. Somebody like Josh Naylor, who let's say he's batting cleanup, there's a pretty good chance that his first at bat is against the left-handed Suter, which just isn't really what you want from Naylor ideally. For somebody like Ramirez, obviously he is matchup proof as far as that goes. So that is nice to see. Philadelphia taking on the Red Sox in Fenway Park. Zach Wheeler is pitching for the Phillies. Cutter Crawford is going for Boston. Very, very difficult matchup for Crawford. Not a terrible pitcher, but not good enough that I really want to be getting to him against one of the best offenses in baseball in a park that plays up offense. Really tough sell on that one. Philadelphia ranks 23rd in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this season. Their WRC plus is much lower than I expected at 93, but obviously they have a ton of talent in that lineup, and overall they've been one of the best teams in baseball. On the other side, though, Zach Wheeler, I do expect to get to a good amount. He's projected for 26% ownership, showed up as optimal about 17% of the time for me. Boston's active roster ranks 26th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year. They do have a 106 WRC plus, so it's not that this is a cake matchup or anything like that for Zach Wheeler. He does still have to be on his game and not make mistakes. If he does, this offense will do damage, especially in this park. But Wheeler is one of the more talented pitchers in baseball in general. Certainly one of the more talented pitchers on tonight's slate. 28.5% K percentage this year, 3.24 xFIP. Wheeler looks good. I do think he's going a little bit over-owned, but as I've said on probably every show I've ever done, that doesn't just remove somebody from tournament consideration, even if you do think that they're getting a little more ownership than warranted. Offensively, I would expect to get to more Philly than Boston. That's what's showing up in the lineups that I built. I wouldn't expect it to look any different. The only real case for getting to Boston is that they're not bad at hitting, and they do negatively correlate with a 25 or so percent owned pitcher. But as I mentioned before, on a 12-game slate, it's just so easy to find teams that are low owned. There is still value in stacking against a popular pitcher, just because if you knock off that pitcher, you are still, knocking off 25% of the field. But the problem is that, like, on shorter slates, let's say there's, 7 games, so there's 14 offenses. If you stack against the popular pitchers, so let's say you stack this Red Sox team against Wheeler, and they do well enough to make Wheeler have a bad game, there's a pretty good chance they're one of the higher scoring teams just because they're only competing with 14 of them. On a slate of this size, they can very easily do enough damage that Wheeler isn't very good and not be remotely close to helping you win tournaments. Like, if Boston just scores 5 runs against Zach Wheeler, then yeah, you knocked off the Zach Wheeler teams, but you're also drawing dead to several other teams, most likely, since there's 24 offenses going tonight. So that, along with the just lower raw ownership in general, how easy it is to be contrarian, is why there's just a little bit less value in going that negatively correlated route on slates of this size as opposed to smaller ones. So Philadelphia offensively is where I would expect to look first, second, and third. Cutter Crawford, not a bad pitcher, but 168 expected ISO to lefties, 166 to righties. Does have a little bit higher strikeout percentage against lefties this year, but we just have a lot of talent in this Phillies lineup. We have, good park for offense. It does play up right-handed power a bit more than left-handed power, but the primary left-handed hitters in the Phillies lineup are good enough that I don't really care too much about the park. Bryce Harper, Kyle Schwarber, obviously you can play those guys anywhere against anybody. They are relatively expensive, so that will hold down the Philadelphia stack a little bit. JT Realmuto, 4,900 at catcher. He's going to look like a good catcher option. One of the better hitting catchers in baseball. Gets the green monster to his pull side, which is nice. So he looks good. Alec Baum's expensive. Bryson Stott's expensive. If you can get to them, great. They're going to be low owned. Those salaries do help keep the ownership down here, but you will have to find value somewhere, which on a 12-game slate obviously isn't as difficult. You're going to have underpriced hitters getting lineup bumps, randomly that we don't know about yet. Pitching in general, you just have more cheap options to choose from. Even if you don't love them, there's just a bigger field, more options. It's more likely that some cheap pitcher does well. So you can certainly get to the Phillies if you want to here. They're not getting much ownership. They do obviously have a very high ceiling. Colorado taking on Minnesota in Minnesota. So sizable park downgrade for the Rockies. Louis Varland is pitching for the Twins. Cal Quantrill is pitching for the Rockies. Quantrill is one of your many generic pitchers on Colorado that we generally just don't want to roster. He's not bad at limiting power, at limiting production. He's not a gas can that you're just blindly stacking against. But from a DFS standpoint, also a 16.9% strikeout percentage, not really what you're going to be targeting most likely on a slate that has 23 pitchers on it. So not really interested in Quantrill here. Varland is the guy that I would be more interested in, and so is the field. Projected for about 19% ownership. Showed up as optimal about 14% of the time for me. Has decent strikeout stuff. Limited sample this year, about a 21% strikeout percentage. If we go back to last season, trying to pull that up quickly, Matt too before the show, but had decent strikeout stuff in the past in the major leagues. My screen is not loading. I want to say from memory that he's like a low 20% guy. Since the start of last season, 22% strikeout percentage against righties, 27% against lefties. If you go back to the start of the 2022 season, 21.4% against righties, 25.8% against lefties. So yeah, a low 20s guy when you average everything out. He's just going to look pretty decent here, especially at a 6K price tag. Good strikeout matchup with Colorado. Good enough strikeout pitcher. Just really, really underpriced here. Certainly one of the guys that I would expect to use if I am trying to get to a expensive stack like the Phillies, for example. Offensively, mentioned it a second ago, Quantrill is not bad at limiting power. Minnesota's coming in middle of the pack as far as stacks go. They do have a relatively high implied run total here, but it's basically an average park for home runs. And again, it's a pitcher that is going to let you put the ball in play. And, certainly you can get hits just by running good on batted balls, but he doesn't give up a ton of power. 149 expected ISO to lefties, only 126 to righties this year. There are some reasonably priced options on Minnesota, which is going to make them a little bit more appealing to stack. Willie Castro led off yesterday at 4,100 with second base outfield eligibility. We'll see if he's at the top of the lineup again today. If he is, then that's going to look like a pretty good value. If he moves back to the bottom of the order, it doesn't look like a good value at all. Jose Miranda is cheap. Royce Lewis is expensive, but really, really good. Correa, Kepler, Jeffers, Larnach, like this whole lineup is pretty reasonably priced against a pitcher that's going to allow them to put the ball in play. So they grade out as a middle of the road stack here. They would certainly look better if Quantrill gave up more power than he does. Colorado on the other side against Varland. I think to some extent you can make that negative correlation argument going up against a 20 or so percent owned Varland, but obviously it has the same limitations as it did 2 minutes ago when I talked about it with regard to Zach Wheeler. Not that Varland is as good as Wheeler, but the strategy itself obviously is the same on a slate of this size. Colorado, of course, doesn't have many good hitters. Michael Tolley at 3,800, I don't mind. First base outfield has the platoon advantage hitting from the left side. Obviously, if you can get to Ryan McMahon, that's fine. 4,500 is a reasonable price tag there. But Minnesota, certainly the preferred stack over the Rockies, I would expect. Pittsburgh is taking on the Cardinals in Busch Stadium in St. Louis. Paul Skeens is pitching for the Pirates, so that always makes for a fun day. Miles Mikolas is going for the Cardinals on the other side. Wes Anderson said Varland plate appearances per home run, 16 versus lefties and 17 to righties. Is that this season or what? Because he hasn't pitched in the majors much this year. Also, the Rockies don't have a lot of guys that are going to do damage. But if that is this season, that obviously is a very, very small sample. Paul Skeens, 9,400, perfectly fine price tag for him. He has been nothing short of fantastic in the major leagues. 35.5% strikeout percentage, 2.15 xFIP. His stuff grades out unbelievably well. If you look at stuff plus or pitching plus metrics since he came up, I believe he is first. If not, he is certainly top 3. He's just been exceptional. His stuff in the minors obviously was great. His production was great. And it's carried over to the major leagues. Has a decent matchup here against the Cards. 104 WRC plus against right-handed pitching, but they do rank 10th in strikeout percentage. And you can see here that Skeens showed up optimal 23% of the time for me, projected for 32% ownership. So I have him going a little bit over-owned, but still one of the more likely pitchers to be optimal. There is also a pretty good chance that Skeens is just being under-projected right now. If you look at a lot of the projection systems across the industry, they certainly are not projecting a 35% strikeout percentage, and they're projecting it to come down quite a bit. He's still, of course, projected to be a very good pitcher, but when you look at how well his stuff is graded out, in addition to the results so far, I do think there's also just a good chance that Skeens is being under-projected, and we're going to start seeing higher projections for him at some point down the road. So I do have that factored in a bit when I ran everything. That is factored into, to some extent at least, into my optimal percentage here. But something to point out, where there's a pretty good chance, like in September or something, when we have even more major league data on Skeens, that you look back and you're like, wow, $9,400 against the Cardinals, and he was only 32% owned. So I'm not overly concerned about the ownership here. He is very clearly one of the best pitching plays on the slate. He's already one of the best pitchers in baseball, realistically. Mikolas on the other side does have a decent matchup against the Pirates. He's not a very good strikeout pitcher. He's not a terrible pitcher overall. 17.8% strikeout percentage, 3.97 xFIP this year. The Pirates do rank 7th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching. They also have an 83 WRC plus. So at 4% owned at 6,500, I do think Mikolas is going a little bit under-owned, but you can see still like a 7.5% chance of being optimal. I don't think he's any sort of a priority, but I think he's a reasonable contrarian play in tournaments. Like, for example, he's $500 more than Varland is. Let's say you're stacking a popular offense and you also want to play Paul Skeens with them. You can very reasonably say, okay, well, I'm just going to use Miles Mikolas here instead of Louis Varland. That's perfectly fine. Varland is the guy that, all things considered, I would want more of. He just projects better and he's cheaper. But Mikolas is certainly somebody you can use. Chunk to Deuce said, "Yeah, I'm sketched out. Why is the K prop? Why the K prop is juiced to the under?" I will say that and this kind of goes back to my point about projections on Skeens. Um, I mean, I've just been getting killed betting Paul Skeens unders because his under generally projects well, but if the projections that are being used are just selling him short, then you're going to lose. And that goes into the props as well. Like if money is coming in on the under and making those props juice to the under, it's because the projections that everyone is using are projecting him to really come back down to earth when it comes to strikeouts. He really might not drop that far. Like he might go from a 35% strikeout guy to like 31% instead of 27 or 28%. And if it turns out long term that Skeens is a 31, 32% strikeout guy, which is entirely possible, then it's going to turn out that everybody betting these unders and hammering these unders and why the lines are juiced to the under are just wrong. So I'm not overly concerned. I don't think this is a situation where like sharp bettors or Vegas or whatever you want to call it know something about Paul Skeens that we don't. Like this guy is one of the best pitching prospects ever. The only question is exactly how good is he? And that's going to be difficult to project because essentially when you're projecting guys going from the minors to the majors, a lot of how you're projecting them is influenced by how similar prospects and how similar talent levels, guys with similar talent levels have adjusted in the past. There's not many guys that are in that Paul Skeens comp territory. So there's just even more volatility in how you're projecting him with the information that you have available. The pitching in this game I think is interesting for one reason or another. Michael is kind of just going under owned, low owned contrarian play. Skeens just looks really good if you can get to him. Like Stephen Leibowitz said too, he said in one sense you expect Skeens to maybe regress. On the other, he's learning more at the major league level. He's obviously facing the best hitters he's ever faced and ever going to face now that he's at the major league level. But this is also somebody that was pitching in the College World Series a year ago. The guy hasn't even had a full year of professional baseball instruction. So you're going to get probably like at some point you'll probably get some sort of a learning curve for him where the league adjusts at least somewhat. But keep in mind too, it's also a lot harder to hit than it is to pitch. So like you see stud hitting prospects come up and either struggle right out of the gate or they are really good and then the league gets tape, gets more video on them and pitchers adjust and they go through, a slump and they have to readjust. The pitcher's the one controlling everything. And it's a lot easier to throw a baseball than it is to hit a baseball. So I don't expect like a prolonged period of Paul Skeens just getting lit up. Maybe he goes through a little stretch where he's not getting the same strikeouts or he's getting hit a little bit harder because teams have figured out some sort of tendency that he has. But, he's adapting as well and he's learning as well. He's theoretically getting the best coaching that he's had as well. So, I think that there's a lot of volatility in, just exactly how you project him going forward. But the thing that there is no volatility in, there's no variance, there's no argument is that this guy is already one of the most talented pitchers in baseball, and he is only $9,400 here as well. Offensively, I wouldn't expect to be getting to either offense too much. Cardinals for very, very obvious reasons against Skeens. Pirates, I think, are the more appealing one. They look like a middle-of-the-road stack here in the lineups that I built before the show. The matchup against Michaelis is obviously better than it is against Skeens, but again, he's not a terrible pitcher. He has allowed a lot of power to lefties this year with a 201 expected ISO. Righties are actually at 199 as well. If you go back to the start of last season, 191 expected ISO to righties, 222 to lefties. This park is not great for hitting home runs, and you don't have great hitters in the Pirates lineup, but I do like some of the pricing here. I think they make some sense as like 2-man or 3-man stacks, even if you don't want to fully go to a 5-man Pirate stack. O'Neal Cruz, 4,300 at shortstop, not having the best season offensively, hopefully improves going forward, but he does have plenty of raw power. He does have some speed. So at 4,300, he looks fine at shortstop. Brian Hayes is cheap at 3,700. If Grandal's catching at 3K, I think that's fine. You have a cheap Rowdy Tellez, although he probably gets pinch hit for, or potentially gets pinch hit for later in the game if the Cardinals were to bring in a lefty against him. Brian Reynolds at 4,100, if he were not an outfielder, would be my favorite play from the Pirates. I think my favorite play is Cruz just because he's a shortstop. But Brian Reynolds is probably your best combination here of just good hitter, platoon advantage, also a switch hitter, so you don't have to worry about him getting matched up with later in the game. Reynolds, just positions aside, is my favorite hitter from the Pirates if you just want a Pirate in a lineup. Next, we have the Yankees taking on the Royals in Kauffman Stadium in Kansas City. Looks like a good offensive game here based on the total. Brady Singer is going for the Royals. Marcus Stroman going for the Yankees. Neither pitcher getting ownership. Neither pitcher really should. This park is good for every offensive category except for hitting home runs. It's good for scoring runs. It's difficult to get strikeouts here. Neither of these pitchers are elite. Both matchups are tough. Brady Singer has made improvements this year, striking out around 24% of hitters with a 3.39 xFIP, but I really just don't feel the need to be getting to an $8,600 pitcher against one of the best offenses in baseball in the Yankees. And not only do they have a 128 WRC plus against right-handed pitching this year, they also are very difficult to strike out. They rank 22nd in strikeout percentage. Juan Soto returned to the lineup yesterday. Aaron Judge got a rest day, but it's not like it was an injury. So I assume you're just going to have Judge and Soto both back in the lineup today. Stanton rested yesterday as well. So I assume that he'll be back. I don't really see any need to get to the pitching here. Stroman, not a good strikeout pitcher anyway. Not a good strikeout matchup. Not a good strikeout park. Not getting any sort of a discount either at 8,400. It's not like it's not like you're getting like a $6,800 price tag and you can just be like, well, maybe Stroman goes 7 innings and just gets a lot of ground balls. At 8,400, you need those strikeouts, especially on a slate of this size. And it's just unlikely you're going to get them from Stroman. Neither pitcher is terrible, so that does limit the stacks a little bit, but they still both look like top 5 overall stacks here. If we just look at 5-mans, they right now look like top 3 stacks. And that's just because you have a lot of talent, a lot of upside on both of these offenses. You clearly have a ton of power on the Yankees where you have Judge and Soto and Stanton, and then you just still have, quality hitters in most other spots in the lineup. As I mentioned, Singer has been better this season. He's still really giving up a lot of power to lefties. 229 expected ISO to left-handed hitters this year, 371 expected WOBA. Righties only have a 295 expected WOBA, 109 expected ISO. Again, I don't really care what Brady Singer is doing against right-handed hitters when it comes to somebody like Aaron Judge, because if he were just consistently facing Aaron Judge, he would be getting lit up by right-handed hitters also. So still obviously play Judge. Stanton's got a ton of power, but it is noteworthy that Singer is getting hit so hard by lefties. Really makes Juan Soto individually look good. Always looks good, but really, looks good in this spot. Whatever other lefties end up in the lineup for the Yankees are going to look a little bit better as well. But Soto clearly is the priority there. On the other side for Kansas City, Stroman basically forever has been a solid pitcher at limiting power. He is giving up more of it this year, though. 200 expected ISO allowed to lefties, 186 to righties. As I mentioned before, this park isn't great for hitting home runs, but you can hit a lot of doubles, just extra base hits outside of home runs, doubles, triples. The outfield is very big, and that's why it's so difficult to hit home runs. But you also just get balls that maybe would be caught falling in for singles or doubles. You can turn singles into doubles, doubles into triples, especially a team like Kansas City that is built to play in this park. They have speed throughout their lineup, so very high upside lineup. You get stolen base upside as well. You get a single off Stroman, steal second base, and it's already better than a double. So there is a lot of upside in this game, regardless. Individually, this is going to go without saying, but I really like Juan Soto. I really like Bobby Witt. I really like Aaron Judge. MJ Melendez is very cheap, getting about 10% ownership right here because he's on a team that has a very high ceiling. He's very inexpensive. So just getting to bats in this game makes sense. Wes Anderson said, Saber Sim 5,000 lineups giving 20% Yankee stacks. Is that too much? So I don't know. In the context of the slate, I don't have an answer for that. I assume I'm going to have less than 20% because I generally play a pretty diversified set of lineups and there's 24 offenses. 20% of a stack is not a number that makes me say yes, that is too much. So, yes and no. I assume again that I have less than 20%. I'm certainly nowhere close to having lineups built for tonight's slate that I would be playing. In the lineups, just as far as an optimal standpoint, they showed up all stack types, 13.5% for me, 5-mans, 2.5%, 4-mans, 3.2%. But keep in mind with those 5 and 4-mans, I'm not forcing stacks. So of the lineups that were stacked, the Yankees would be making up more than 5.5% or whatever it was. So yeah, I think just as far as the direct question, is 20% too much? Probably not. I think I would personally play less than that, but it showing up like that across 5,000 lineups, I don't think is overly concerning. Blue Jays are taking on the Milwaukee Brewers tonight in Milwaukee. Christopher Rodriguez is expected to make his debut for the Brewers. He is not in the set of lineups that I built. He is in the DraftKings player pool. Just don't have him in right now. He has decent strikeout stuff, but he's jumping up to the majors from AAA. Doesn't project particularly well in this spot, I don't think. It is a tough matchup against the Blue Jays. His numbers at AAA were not great. He projects as around like a 20% strikeout guy in most projection systems right now. Projects for a FIP in like the upper fours. Not somebody that I really expect to be wanting to get to against a Toronto team that has a lot of right-handed power that doesn't strike out very often. He is, I believe, 6,900 on DraftKings. But again, I don't think he's really going to be somebody that we're getting to. Yusei Kikuchi on the other side, projected for about 10% ownership. Actually coming in a little bit under-owned for me. Showed up optimal 15% of the time in the lineups that I built. Kikuchi does give you strikeout upside. He went through a little bit of a slump, I guess, prior to his last start, and then came out and dominated the Orioles, who are one of the best offenses in baseball, one of the best offenses against left-handed pitching. This is not a safe spot for him against Milwaukee, but he does give you strikeout upside. 23.7% K percentage overall this season, 3.3 xFIP. It is a dangerous park to pitch in, but I do think that, in large field tournaments, he's going a little bit under-owned, makes him an interesting tournament play because he does give you that strikeout upside, and he's only getting about 10% ownership. Offensively, the Blue Jays are going to look pretty good here, going up against a pitcher making his major league debut. And I misspoke. It is Carlos Rodriguez, not Christopher. But everything else I said was true. Going up against a guy making his major league debut, he is right-handed at AAA this year. 11 starts, 12 total games, 62 and 2/3 innings pitched, 4.69 FIP, 5.13 xFIP. Struck out 24.5% of hitters. But like I said before, most publicly available projection systems have around the 20% K percentage, FIP ranging from 4.5 to 5. This is somebody that the assumption right now should probably be that he's going to have some bumps and bruises getting adjusted to facing major league lineups, especially when you talk about a lineup like the Blue Jays that just has all of these veteran hitters in their lineup. They rank 28th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year, 101 WRC+, and that number probably just goes up as the season goes on as well because of the talent that we know that this lineup has and the fact that they got off to some slow starts. So they were showing up second most as a stack. Vlad Guerrero, first base, third base, really nice eligibility for him. Obviously gives you a ton of upside. This is another reason that Toronto stacks look good, though. It's not just the park and not just the matchup, but it's the flexibility that you have within there. Not only that you have some relatively inexpensive bats, especially for their talent level, but the flexibility with their positions. First base, third base for Vlad Guerrero. Second base, outfield for Davis Schneider. Kiner Falefa, obviously not the same level of hitter, but second base, third base for him at a cheap price tag. It makes them just easier to stack, and it makes them easy to mini stack as well. Because in a lot of cases, whatever your 5-man stack is, if you're like, okay, now I want 2 or 3 guys that are reasonably priced and give me upside from a different team, kind of no matter what you stacked on your primary team, you're going to be able to find Blue Jays that fit because of the flexibility in their positions. So that combined with the salaries, Danny Jansen gives you power at catcher. Bo Bichette gives you upside at shortstop. 2 of the positions that at times can be difficult to find upside at, especially reasonably priced. Obviously, there's a lot of most of the best players in baseball at this point are shortstops, but they're all like 6K plus. It can be tough to find upside at the position in that mid 4K range. Bichette gives you that. You also have Spencer Horwitz, who's up from the minors. He was hitting second yesterday, projected to hit second again today. He's sub 3K on DraftKings, so that's another value bet in there. There's just a multitude of reasons that the Blue Jays are going to look good here that even go beyond just simply facing a guy making his major league debut in American Family Life Values Field, whatever they're calling Miller Park. Milwaukee on the other side, if you want to go to them because of their talent in this park at low ownership, sure. Very easy to see how they win a slate for you. It's not an ideal matchup against Kikuchi, as I was mentioning before. Right-handed hitters this year, only a 145 expected ISO against him. Lefties are below 100. But you do have probably the best hitting catcher in baseball, certainly on the short list at least, in William Contreras at 5,500. Willy Adames, 4,400, another high upside shortstop in that mid 4K range. The Brewers as an offense are just very, very good and in a good hitter's park at low ownership. So from that standpoint, perfectly fine in tournaments. From an actual matchup standpoint, not the best matchup here against Kikuchi. Angels are taking on the Diamondbacks in Arizona. Jose Suarez getting the start for the Angels. He has not been starting games this year. He's been working out of the bullpen. I don't expect him to go deep into this game. I'm not going to be playing him. Jordan Montgomery on the other side somehow still continues to be $8,000 despite pitching like a minor league pitcher so far this year. We're getting far enough into the season that just blaming it on rust because he missed spring training is probably not the correct answer. He's really difficult to talk about at this point because so far this season, he's only struck out 13.8% of hitters. 4.64 xFIP is like 2 full runs lower than his ERA. His 4.74 FIP is in that same ballpark as well. 4.99 Scherer. So, like, if you look at his more advanced metrics, he's not been as bad at preventing runs as his ERA suggests, but he's still been below average, and he's not striking guys out. This is somebody that in the past is, generally a low 20s, like 20 to 22% strikeout guy, doesn't give up a lot of power. He's been a very different pitcher so far this season. And, at some point, maybe it changes, but we're in the middle of June now. This isn't, his third start after missing spring training anymore or anything like that. Then you also get this matchup against the Angels who, they don't have a ton of name value necessarily in their lineup, but since the start of last season, their active roster has a 121 WRC plus against left-handed pitching. That is very, very good. The park is not as good as Angel Stadium, so that's a negative here for the Angels. But the upside that they offer is pretty nice. 179 expected ISO allowed to righties so far this year for Montgomery. Only an 11% strikeout percentage against them. He's been much better against lefties, as you would expect. 25% K percentage, sub 100 expected ISO allowed there. But you're just going to get a lot of right-handed bats most likely for the Angels. Logan O'Hoppe is going to look like a strong catcher option. Luis Rengifo with second base, third base eligibility gives you some stolen base upside as well. Happy to get to him. Zach Neto will probably be towards the bottom of the order, but he's a cheap shortstop. Joe Adell probably towards the top of the order, more right-handed power. Taylor Ward. Kevin Pillar has somehow figured out how to hit. I don't know how long that lasts. He has a pretty long career of primarily being a defensively, oriented outfielder, but this year he's been hitting. So even with the park downgrade here, I do think the Angels are pretty interesting, especially because they're not getting much ownership. You can see here that really across the board, they're projected to go on their own. And I think one reason for that is that Jordan Montgomery is difficult to project right now. There's two sides to that. One, there is certainly the potential that, I think he's projected for like 11, 12 DraftKings points right now. There's certainly the potential that that's even a little bit too high on Montgomery based on what we've seen from him this season. But the other side to that is the Angels hitters, if you buy into this version of Jordan Montgomery, or at least you buy into it for right now, like you don't have to necessarily say like, I think in 2 years, Jordan Montgomery is still going to be this level of pitcher. Obviously, if that's the case, he wouldn't even be in baseball. But even if you just for right now say like something is clearly up with Montgomery, he doesn't have it. Projections on the Angels are just naturally going to be a little bit too low because projection systems are still very heavily weighting everything that Jordan Montgomery has done prior to this season. So the Angels do look like they're going a little bit under-owned to me. I do like them in tournaments. On the other side, Arizona, they look fine. They're getting a bit more ownership, but Ketel Marte at 5,100 looks pretty good at second base. It's, I think, sort of a semi-bullpen game. I'm not expecting like 1 or 2 innings out of Suarez, but I don't think he's going like 6. I would expect the Angels are happy if you get like 4 or 5 out of him. He hasn't pitched very well this year. He lost his spot in the rotation and then hasn't been great out of the bullpen. So I do think it's a pretty good spot for Arizona. You can see they're certainly getting a lot more ownership than the Angels are, at least at a couple of spots. Gabby Moreno, very, very, very good value at catcher, assuming he's hitting second here. Ketel Marte, again, going to look really good. Then the ownership drops off a bit with like Christian Walker, Lourdes Gurriel. Still high upside plays. Randall Grichuk will be a popular value play also. Keep in mind, with somebody like Grichuk, you do face pinch hit risk in the middle innings. Once you get Suarez out of that game, the Diamondbacks do have left-handed outfielders that they can use to hit for Grichuk. Assuming that they're not all in the starting lineup, there's a good chance that will happen. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about a 12% owned on a 12-game slate, Randall Grichuk. Like, it's a good matchup for him. and he's very fairly priced, but he's probably not still playing when this game ends. So there is, plenty of pinch hit risk there. But overall, the Diamondbacks, I think, are going a little bit overowned, but still look pretty good. One of the higher implied run totals on the slate against the Angels. White Sox taking on the Mariners. Drew Thorpe is going for the White Sox. Brian Wu is pitching for the Mariners. Very good spot for Wu. His strikeout stuff so far this season has not been as good as it was in the past. It hasn't been as good as you would project going forward. Only a 20.2% strikeout percentage. Does have a 3.7 xFIP. He's been solid overall. Probably, you probably see a higher strikeout percentage going forward than you have so far this season. It is a good matchup against the White Sox. They rank 4th in strikeout percentage this season on their active roster against right-handed pitching. They only have an 88 WRC+. So you're seeing 35% ownership come into Wu. 18.5% optimal percentage for me at 8,900. Looks good. The optimal percentage is basically just reminding you that there's a lot of other pitchers priced around him, but also keep in mind, you're not trying to make the optimal lineup in baseball. So that's why just looking, especially with pitching where it's only one spot in your lineup, just looking and saying this guy's going over-owned isn't going to give you any great conclusions because you can still build very good contrarian lineups that have an over-owned pitcher. It doesn't matter all that much. He is one of the more likely pitchers to succeed in this spot. Drew Thorpe, 7,700, projected for about 5% ownership, showing up as optimal around 7.5% of the time for me at Double-A this season. So he hasn't pitched above Double-A. Last year, he split time with the Yankees, 18 starts in High A, and then pitched about 30 innings across 5 starts at Double-A. 11 starts at Double-A for the White Sox this year, 60 innings pitched. He has a 25% strikeout percentage, 3.02 FIP. Projection systems expect like an 18 to 21% strikeout percentage, depending which one you look at in the major leagues, a 4 to 4.5 FIP. He looks like a quality pitcher. This isn't Paul Skeens coming up and somebody that's probably just going to be great right out of the gate. There is also that added volatility because he hasn't even pitched above the Double-A level. He hasn't even thrown 100 innings at Double-A. So he looks talented. I think that is a safe way to put it. What that results in immediately at the major league level is probably like an average-ish pitcher. So it's an okay spot, I think, for Seattle, but it is a very good pitcher's park, very difficult park to hit home runs. We know that Seattle strikes out a lot as well. So if you're getting to a little bit of Thorpe at 7,700, I think that's fine. I don't think he's a priority here. Wu, I think, is. From a stacking standpoint, Seattle not grading out very well because of the park. I will add that, again, just to reiterate, there is a lot of volatility when you get a guy making his major league debut straight out of Double-A. This guy very well could end up just being an average pitcher for the rest of this season, but you never know how nerves are going to affect somebody in their first major league start. Just because he's average by the end of the season doesn't mean that he doesn't get the shit kicked out of him today. So there is that just sort of even added on top. There's always upside for every offense, but especially like the Mariners do have quality hitters. They do have power in their lineup. There's always going to be upside there. There is like an added level to it in a spot like this that makes them somewhat interesting at low ownership. But other than that, the park does still suck. It's going to be tough to really, I think, prioritize them on a slate of this size. Cal Raleigh is always an interesting catching option because he just has a lot of power and he is reasonably priced. You potentially have a 2K flat Tyler Locklear in the lineup now. He played at first base for them last night. Rodriguez has been pretty unlucky this year. Expected power numbers are still pretty solid. I don't mind getting to him, but there's no shortage of 5K outfielders that you can go to. So secondary spot, I think, for Seattle. A little bit intrigued just because of the matchup with a guy making his debut. Oakland facing the Padres in San Diego. Talked about it in Discord yesterday. I think I might have mentioned it on the show the other day as well. I have no idea what to make of Petco Park right now. It has the highest home run park factor in baseball this season. It is likely that it's just a sample size thing because this park does have a history of being average at absolute best for home runs and generally below average. I've looked online. I haven't been able to find anything about changes to the park that would explain the difference. Cleveland, like somebody asked the other day on a show about Cleveland, and I didn't know off the top of my head, but somebody else told me on Twitter later that they like removed shipping containers from their upper deck, I guess, in right field, and it created a jet stream. So now you're just getting fly balls just flying out of whatever they call that stadium. I can't find anything like that about San Diego. The only things I can find are articles from like 2022 saying that there is theory that every park having a humidor for their baseballs now would make Petco Park a relatively good place to hit home runs. But then we had 2022 and 2023 play out, and that didn't happen. So outside of articles like that, I can't find anything. I assume that we just get this going back to being a not great park for hitting homers. But you have two not great pitchers on the mound today if you want to, see if guys still can hit home runs in Petco Park today. Randy Vasquez is getting ownership because he's only 5,600 against the A's. He showed up optimal around 15% of the time for me, 18% ownership. This is just a pricing play. He's not a particularly good pitcher, but I've said it 100 times. You should just never have fully stretched out major league or really even like 4A level starting pitchers at less than like $6,500. He's just by default underpriced at 5,600. 5 starts at AAA this year, struck out 22.5% of hitters, projects around the 20% strikeout percentage, around the 4.5 FIP. Again, he's just a guy, but just a guy starting games as a pitcher in the major leagues is not $5,600. So that's why you're seeing that ownership go in there. On the other side, JP Sears has the much more difficult matchup. The Padres are one of the most difficult teams to strike out in Major League Baseball. They have a ton of good hitters. Sears himself is, whatever as a pitcher. 17.7% K percentage, 4.74 xFIP this year. But you're going to have a lot of right-handed power in this Padres lineup. Righties against Sears, 206 expected ISO, 16.5% K percentage. Not somebody I'm looking to get to. I think Vasquez looks fine, even though I don't have a lot of confidence in him. The price tag makes him look good. Now, I do think that the A's, from a stacking standpoint, they're not showing up a ton as far as being optimal in the lineups I built before the show, and actually neither is San Diego, which is a little surprising. But I do think the A's are kind of interesting because they do have a lot of power, and they are facing, 15 to 20% owned pitcher. On shorter slates, I would really love the A's. On this slate, again, like I was saying earlier, the A's can do damage against Vasquez and still just be a middle of the road team. So that, keeps the interest in check a little bit. But I do think there's at least spots where you can get to very low owned, high upside guys as one offs, as two mans. Shea Langeliers, very good hitting catcher at 4,100. Seth Brown, 2,900, does have some pinch hit risk, but has power. I don't mind that. Brent Rooker is good. Toro is cheap. Lede is cheap. Like, I think the A's are a pretty interesting team to maybe just grab like 1, 2, 3 of them, mix them in with a higher probability primary stack. You're getting low ownership. You're getting power. You're getting some negative correlation with the field. I think they're a pretty good mini stack team. San Diego, I'm surprised they're not showing up more for me now. Maybe they will later in the day. But I mentioned, that JP Sears does have issues with right-handed power. This park has played up power this year for whatever that's worth, which maybe isn't much. Maybe it is. I don't know. But, Fernando Tatis, always just a really high upside option. Manny Machado, reasonably priced at 4,700. Those guys both look pretty good to me. Donovan Solano is cheap with MPE. Although the issue with Solano is he's going to be a pretty good point per dollar projection, and having multi-position eligibility is nice. The problem here is, like, if you're talking about him in the context of a Padres stack, you would be playing him at first base probably because you're playing Machado at third, and playing somebody like Donovan Solano at first base is just naturally going to limit the upside of your lineup because first base is a position where you can get legitimate power threats, double dong power threats. Donovan Solano is not that guy. So he is somebody where I think there's a pretty big difference between like his average, his mean projection relative to his salary and like what he's actually doing to help you win tournaments. So that's something to keep in mind. Profar has been good this year, 4,200 in the outfield. Kim's pretty cheap. Campusano is cheap. So yeah, wouldn't be surprised if the Padres show up a little bit more for me later on today. But they're not getting much ownership here, so maybe they don't. Individually, Tatis and Machado certainly look good. Houston is in San Francisco taking on the Giants. We know that Houston's lineup is a bit watered down right now without Kyle Tucker. Alex Bregman was in the lineup yesterday. Yainer Diaz was not. Diaz appears to be questionable today. So if he's in there, it does make the lineup better. I had mentioned it in Discord yesterday that once you got Caratini in there in place of Diaz, the stack as a whole just looked worse because it's always really nice to be able to cover the catcher position in your stacks with a good hitter, which Caratini is not. So Diaz's status does affect how Houston stacks look at least a bit. Ronel Blanco is going for Houston at $9,700. Jordan Hicks going for the Giants. Both of these guys look like they're going a little bit under-owned relative to optimal percentage. Neither guy looks like a priority here. Ronel Blanco has been fine this year. He does give you some strikeout upside. He has a 22.8% strikeout percentage, but he walks too many guys, 10.5% walk percentage, 4.21 xFIP. And the big problem here is how in the world is it possible that Ronel Blanco is more expensive than Paul Skeens? I do not care who they're facing. It's not like the Giants are an elite matchup anyway. 16th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching. But, I mean, you could tell me Blanco is facing the White Sox or the Rockies or the worst hitters from those two teams combined in one lineup in Seattle, and he still shouldn't be more expensive than Paul Skeens. So that's the big issue here. And so I think what the ownership numbers or the optimal percentage rather is telling you is like, yeah, if you play this slate out a million times, Ronel Blanco is going to beat Paul Skeens often enough, or Ronel Blanco is just going to have a good game and you would want him alongside Skeens often enough that there shouldn't be like as big an ownership gap between Blanco and other guys, like Skeens as there is. But you're only playing the slate once, and there's going to be other spots that are probably better to get to be contrarian than Ronel Blanco at this salary. So if you're just stacking cheap teams and you can afford Blanco without sacrificing anything, that's a pretty good time, I think, to roll the dice on him at 5% owned and just hope he goes out there and has a good game. But I'm not, even though the optimal percentage is higher than the ownership, I'm not actually hoping to be pivoting Paul Skeens to Ronel Blanco to be different. I think on this slate, I can find enough ways to be different without doing something as aggressive as that. Jordan Hicks, obviously a terrible matchup against Houston. Not as bad as it could be with no Tucker, but 8,300, 3% ownership, 6% chance of being optimal. I don't think there's a lot to see there either. Not a good park for hitting home runs, which does limit the interest in stacks as well. Houston does have talent, obviously. Hicks is not a bad pitcher. We have seen the strikeout percentage come down a bit this year as a starter, but he's been pretty solid at limiting power. 134 expected ISO to lefties, 170 to righties, sub 300 expected WOBA to righties, 342 to lefties. So lefties are getting on base against him more, but righties are doing more damage so far. This park just does a good job limiting power. Anytime you're getting to Altuve, Pena, Alvarez, Bregman, you're not wrong, especially when they're relatively inexpensive. Like a $5,300 price tag on Alvarez is pretty close to the floor as far as his salary goes. But the park's not great. The matchup's not great. If you're playing Houston here, it's mostly just because of Houston's talent at low ownership, which, like I said before, you're never wrong. Like if Houston, every slate is just going to be, if Houston's just 3% owned every slate, and you go into a season saying I'm going to play Houston every time they're 3% owned, you probably come out ahead. But there's nothing matchup-wise or park-wise that makes them look good here. Same goes for San Francisco. The matchup with Blanco is not great. He has been more susceptible to left-handed hitters this year than righties. Not that he's been bad against lefties, but a 199 expected ISO. But again, you're getting a park here that just kills left-handed home runs. So pretty tough to want to get to the Giants either. And then finally, we do get a good hitter's park to wrap this one up. Rangers facing the Dodgers in Dodger Stadium. Dane Dunning is pitching for Texas. James Paxton going for the Rangers. Not interested in either pitcher. Dunning has seen a nice uptick in strikeout stuff this year. 26.9% K percentage is actually the fourth highest on the slate. It's only behind Skeens, Wheeler, and McGill. And like I said, McGill's probably coming down as he gets more starts as well. So somehow Dane Dunning, one of the better strikeout pitchers, but he's facing the Dodgers, a team that's tough to strike out, a team that's really, really good. And you do also have issues on how deep into games Dunning goes. Texas tends to prefer not letting him get through a lineup the third time. I'm not really looking to get to much, if any, Dunning here. James Paxton, very clearly on the back end of his career, just not good anymore. 1.3 K minus BB percentage. That is as bad as it gets. 14.2% K percentage, 12.9% walk percentage, 5.38 xFIP. He is just not good anymore. Honestly, kind of surprised that we have as low an implied run total as we do on the Rangers right now. But I'm not looking to get to the pitching. I am interested in both stacks if you can afford them. The Dodgers are not showing up nearly as much as I would have expected here. Maybe because of price. I don't really know. The Rangers are showing up more, which I am happy to see. I do think this is a spot where maybe you get some. Yeah, the Rangers, I think, are just going a little bit under-owned. And this is similar to the Jordan Montgomery spot. most industry projections are just projecting James Paxton as if he's a much better pitcher than he has been this year. Maybe he improves, but there's nothing in the underlying numbers to suggest that's going to happen. Like, I cannot find anything that says James Paxton is getting unlucky and he should be getting better results. The only thing about James Paxton that suggests he should be getting better results is James Paxton used to be a better pitcher than he is now. So with something like that, like especially with his injury history, I think there's a good chance that he's just done. And this is more or less who James Paxton is. So I'm happy to be getting to low-owned Rangers against James Paxton here in a good hitter's park, especially, on a slate like this where, yeah, there's 24 offenses going. There really have not been spots that stood out as, this is a really bad pitcher. I don't know how this offense doesn't light him up. We haven't had those spots on this slate. And I think that was reflected when we talked about that Kansas City and New York game where you had Stroman facing Singer. So you had like two good average to good pitchers and two like top 5 stacks. I think that's kind of reinforced how you don't really have those great matchups on this slate. You have a lot of good pitcher sparks. You have a lot of just quality pitchers in general. So Paxton is one of the worst, if not the worst, honestly, pitchers on this slate. Texas, we know, is a good offense, especially if Seager's back in the lineup. I like getting to them in this park. The Dodgers, obviously, if you can get to them, great. While Dunning's strikeout stuff is up this year, he is giving up power as well. So that's something to keep in mind in addition to it being a good hitter's park. 270 expected ISO allowed to lefties, 192 to righties. Goes without saying, whatever you can get to of Ohtani, that's anybody else on the Dodgers. So I think this, this game, last game on the slate, people talk about having a late night hammer, and that's not something that like you're actually actively seeking out. But it is fun sometimes when you have it. You can just climb the leaderboard at the end of the night. I would not be upset at all if I'm getting aggressively to both of these offenses. Texas, I think, is the easier one to get to when you factor in salary and everything. But I like both of them. So to recap, top pitching on the slate, we're starting with Paul Skeens. He is fantastic. Brian Wu, Zach Wheeler, both look good as well. Randy Vasquez and Louis Varland are your best value pitchers. As far as under-owned pitchers, I think Kikuchi looks pretty interesting at 9,100. You could certainly make the case for somebody like Blanco, but again, it's just really tough to pay a higher salary for Blanco than for Paul Skeens. Just insane pricing there. Offensively, I like both sides of the Kansas City and New York game in Kauffman. The Blue Jays look good against a pitcher making his major league debut. I like Texas against Paxton. I would love to get to the Dodgers if I can. Pricing, obviously, an issue there. But this is a really, really wide open 12-game slate. Looks like a probably pretty fun tournament slate. I think you can build a lot of lineups that look good, that you're happy with, and that are low-owned. So looking forward to it. Thanks for checking out the show. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up button, comment, subscribe to the channel, all that stuff. If you are subscribed to my Dub Club package, I'll be around in Discord today. We can talk more about the slate there. Thanks again for checking out the show, and good luck on your lineups tonight.